Hey everybody, welcome to another episode in our series on close reading. This one is about TiPeCAST. It is a graphic organizer, a close reading system exclusively designed for poetry. You may have heard of it as TP-CAST or TP-CAST with extra T's at the end, but I like to go with TiPeCAST because when you can turn an acronym into a real word, that's the awesomest thing in the world. Anyway, theme song. Okay, here we go, TiPeCAST. The T stands for title. Now, this might seem like an obvious point, but I've taught enough students over the years to know that it is not always an obvious point. Writers write what they write on purpose, and that includes their titles. And when you're talking about poetry, because poets are trying to squeeze as much information into as few words as possible, the title essentially becomes another line in the poem. So it's not just important, because it gives us some insight into what the author is thinking, but it's important because sometimes the title is actually critical information that we need to know. I'll give you an example. There's this great short poem by Lucille Clifton called "Why Some People Be Mad at Me Sometimes." The body of that poem is only a few lines long, and nowhere does she say, people are mad because. Instead, the rest of the poem is simply the reason, right? That people are asking her to remember, she says, but they want her to remember their history and not her own history. I think it's a subtle indictment of white privilege, but you wouldn't necessarily get that. You probably wouldn't get that at all if it didn't have that title. The very famous poem about "I have eaten the plums in the icebox that you were probably saving for dinner." Forgive me, they were so delicious, so cold. That William Carlos Williams poem. The title is "This is just to say," right? The first line of the poem is "I have eaten the plums," and if you read that without the title, it gives a completely different impression than if you're reading with the title. All of that is just a very long way of saying the title of today's poem, our sample text, is "Saturday at the Canal" by Gary Soto. I wanted you to hear that title without seeing or reading any of the rest of the poem, so that's why I didn't have you pause and go read it earlier. I will in just a second. But let's talk about what the title of this poem can tell us. Well, there are a couple of things. Number one, it's a weekend. Saturday at the... No? Okay. Number two, there's a canal involved. One of the great secrets to literary analysis that I always tell students is that water always means something. When an author puts water into a piece of writing, it is going to mean something. And frequently, you might think about the book Huckleberry Finn, for example. Frequently, water represents a journey, going from one place to another. So that's just something to think about as you approach the rest of the poem. There is a link to it down below in the comments in the additional information section there. So please pause now, go read that poem, and then we'll come back and make our way through the rest of the graphic organizer. Why are you're supposed to just pause? Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the poem. It is about people like you, teenagers, who are unhappy, presumably, in school, which, as far as I know, is like every teenager in the world. So, PE stands for paraphrase. There's an E at the end of paraphrase, so it works. Anyway, the idea here is that you take a couple of important lines, maybe three important lines, and you put them into your own words so that you can make sure that you really understand what the poem is about. And like the first line of the poem, "I was hoping to be happy by 17. You could rewrite that as "I'm 17 and I'm unhappy," right? Which again, I think is like all 17-year-olds. There are some other important lines from the poem that we might want to paraphrase. There's the line about how they wanted San Francisco to be more than just a postcard on a bedroom wall, which you could really paraphrase as they really want to go to San Francisco. Or lines 14 to 15. These are really good because it talks about they don't drink, they don't smoke, but their hair is long and their hair is wild when it's windy. You kind of paraphrase that as, we're a couple of squares, but deep down we kind of think we're cool. Just so by paraphrasing those lines, you really get a sense of who these characters are, how they feel, and what they want. C is for connotations. And this is really where you're looking for figurative language or any other particular language techniques, uses of creative diction or interesting syntax. And I would point you to the second line of the poem, for example. There is a metaphor, but I want you to pay attention to the diction that Soto uses in that line. He says, school was a sharp check mark in the grade book. Obviously, that is a metaphor. School is not literally a check mark, but sharp check mark. I'm over enunciating a little bit, but those are all very painful words. They're hard words. They have those kinds of sounds in them. It's almost like Soto chose those words on purpose to have that sort of slow, hard, impacty kind of feeling. There's a lot of imagery in the poem, particularly when he's talking about the dryness or the dustiness of the ground. You know, they're by the canal, right? But the ground where they can actually stand is dry. That'll come up a little bit later. But there's also that line in that section about the shadows of loneliness. Again, obviously a metaphor. Loneliness does not really cast a shadow, but metaphorically, if you are feeling lonely, it's like there is a shadow over you. Symbolically, right? How does he describe the water in the canal? I said water always means something, and he describes it by saying it's white-tipped but dark underneath. Like there's this layer up here, but deep down there's something kind of like how they don't drink or smoke. They're kind of squares, but their hair is long, so they like to think of themselves as wild. There's this inside darkness to them that gives them a separate identity from the white tip on the outside. And think about where the water is going, right? The last little bit of the poem, the last phrase of the poem is racing out of town. The water in the canal gets to leave. They stay. Attitude, tone. There's some really choice words. Loneliness, for example, or the clause, the years froze. Again, metaphorical. You can't put years in a freezer and then thaw them out later when you need them. No, that would be kind of cool. But there are lots of other things that really kind of show a sadness or frustration. You know, the hallway stank of unwashed hair, the dry, loose dirt on the ground, that, dry dirt, what's the point of that? It's dusty. He says he's feeling awful, and then of course there's like these shadows of loneliness again. Shifts, and we have to be careful when we say that. One of the reasons I really like the TiPeCAST or TP-CAST organizer is because of the inclusion of shifts. Many poems, pretty much most poems, maybe almost all poems, have a moment in them where the perspective changes, or where the author stops describing the present and starts commenting on the present. There's some point in a poem where it goes from one thing to another. Soto actually uses a fantastic transition word at line 6. Right at the end of line 6, he says, thus, right? Lines 1 through 5 and the first part of 6 describe the crappiness of their current situation, the sharp check mark, the tuba at the pep rally playing for the football team. And these guys are squares, okay? They're not playing football. This is all terrible. This is what they hate. Thus, on Saturday, when they're not stuck at school, they're out at the canal throwing rocks into the water, and they're thinking about how lucky that water is to be leaving when they are not. That word thus there at line 6 carries a lot of weight and marks a shift. And then finally, theme. Now, some teachers might use the TP-CAST with an extra T where they want you to go back to the title. I don't necessarily think you need to do that. I think, the title, putting that up there at the top before you read the rest of the poem is going to inform the way you read the poem. I don't necessarily believe you have to go back to it, but you can. But theme is where I really want you to get. And the other thing I love about TiPeCAST, besides the S for shifts, is that this really leads you down to theme, so that by the time you get to the last line in this graphic organizer, I don't think I said this, but there is a downloadable version linked in the description. By the time you get to that graphic organizer, you should have all of the information that you need to say what the theme of the poem is. You should even already have the important evidence from the poem written down for you and even paraphrased for you. I think what we're seeing here in this poem by Gary Soto is that life can be really hard for teenagers, and there are many, many times when they want to escape from where they are. So he's talking about, and some things I didn't cover earlier in this episode, but he's talking about following the birds while they're migrating. Like, we want to get out of here. We're coming with you, birds. Or, the gentle sway of a train as it takes him and his friend across country to San Francisco. All of it, every single word in this poem is really pointing to, we want out. And the amazing thing about this poem, and one of the things that I really love, is the way that last description of the water reinforces it, puts an exclamation point on it, basically says, yeah, Gary Soto, you're stuck, because the water is racing out of town. And you know that these boys would be racing out of town if they had the means or the opportunity, but they don't. They're stuck in the sharp check mark of their lives. I went through it very fast. Obviously, you probably want to practice this a lot, but this is a really good close reading strategy for any kind of poem, because it does take you through all the sorts of things that a poet would do when the poet is writing their poems on purpose. I'll see you for the next one.